So welcome to Lecture 4 of the FIK3507 course in Statistical Problems and Simulation. In this lecture we're going to deal with different variance reduction techniques. I'm presenting this will be Jan Sander. I'm a professor of radio communication systems at the Radio Communication Systems Lab, Department of Communication Systems at the School of ICT at KTH in Stockholm. In the previous lectures we have been dealing with the basics of simulation. We have been looking at how to generate random variables, how to model the system, and how to analyze output data and to make estimates of statistical parameters. In this lecture we're going to discuss how we can make our simulations more effective. And so what do we mean by efficient simulation? Well, there are a number of issues involved in this, and we already mentioned several times what we can call the curse of the square root. We know that the error in simulations decreases as 1 over the square root of n, or the standard deviation of our estimators tend to decrease as 1 over the square root of n. In addition, if we have rare events, it's actually n is not the number of simulation runs, it's actually the number of events of interest that occur. So if we have very low probability events that we want to estimate, let's say the probability of, and they never occur, our standard deviation over the error will be very large, even though we run many runs. So the question we're going to ask ourselves in this lecture is, can we reduce the variance of our estimators by clever designs of simulation experiments? And reduced variance due to the square root law here leads to faster simulations. If we can reduce the variance, we will need fewer runs. N can be lower. In this lecture we will cover some of the recipes that are found in the cookbook of chapter 9 in Ross. There are a number of techniques with different names: antithetic variates, control variates, conditioning, importance samplings, and a few others. They all have in common that they try to reduce the variance of our estimators and by cleverly designing our experiments. There's no single recipe that works for all simulation problems, so it's good to have a cookbook to select from to see what particular technique can be applicable to the problem that you have at hand. The first technique we're going to study is called antithetic variates, and this is how they work. Let's assume that we want to estimate an expectation, or so the parameter interested in theta is the expectation of a random variable z. And in our simulation we have access to two variables, z and z star, and they both have identical distributions. So we can do the following estimates. We can make an estimate of theta based on z, called theta prime, and we can make an estimate based on zeta star, which we call theta bis. And both of these, theta prime and theta bis, they are unbiased estimators of, or would have expectation theta, so they are, both of them work. And of course, if we take the average, the arithmetic average of those, that will also be an estimator that can work and is also unbiased. So we can see that the expectations of all these three estimators is theta, so they are all our unbiased estimators. But let's look at this last estimator, theta 3, which if we compute the variance of this, we know that the variance of a sum of two random variables can be expressed as an expression here. So we have two variance terms and two covariance terms. And if we simplify the expression, we can see that the variance will be the variance of z, and then there's a parenthesis 1 plus the correlation of z star. Correlation is the normalized covariance. And based on this formula we can now see an obvious trick here. If we can pick z and z star such that the covariance z star is negative, we can see actually that the variance of theta 3 will be lower than the variance of z. And so we can reduce the variance in this way. And an example how we can do this, let's say that we drive our simulator with uniform random variables, u1, u2, and to um to generate z, do this function h. We can generate z star by driving the same simulator by variance by the variables 1 minus u1, minus u2, and 1 minus um. Here it's clear that the two variables um and 1 minus um, they are negatively correlated. And it's on the other hand not so obvious to show that z and z star are negatively correlated, but there are some requirements on h. For instance, that is if h is a monotonously increasing function as described in Ross in chapter 9, you can show that the correlation between z and z star actually is negative. And so this is a very simple way of doing two simulation runs with the two different sets of random variables that can actually reduce the variance. So if you don't know if it works, try it out and see what the variance is. And if it works, you have made a gain. If it doesn't work, try some other technique. The second technique we're going to discuss is called control variates. And again, we have a vector x, a simulation output, and we want to make a estimate of e of x, or theta. And in addition now, we assume that we have another observation from our system called y, with, let's say, assume it has, where we know the expectation of y, call it mu y. And now we form a new estimator, and that is x, and we add a term c times y minus mu y. And we can clearly see that this is also an unbiased estimator of theta. And of course we get theta hat by summing over the different output xi and the yi's. So what is the benefit of this? Well, we can show that the variance of theta prime can now be described as in the equation here, and you can see there again as a variance terms for x and y, and there's a covariance term, covariance xy, which is the covariance between x and y. And by completing the squares, we can show that the variance has to be larger than the equation at the bottom. And we can show that this inequality can be fulfilled with equality when we pick the parameter c, or the as c star, which is equal to minus the covariance of xy divided by the variance of y. And since we don't know the covariance of x and y, we of course have to, as usually, do an estimate, and we can use the sample covariance instead of the covariance. And if you have studied linear regression, you can clearly see what is the idea here is that if y is strongly correlated with x, then what we do here is that we do linear regression on y and remove that component from x. So the what is uncertain about x becomes less, and the variance will be decreased. To make this a little bit less abstract, let's take a simple examples. Let's assume that we have an observation of x, 10 samples on the left here, and then we have 10 samples of the variable y. And we suspect that y carries significant information about x, so we want to use a control variate technique here. We can assume that the expectation of y is known. In this case, the expectation is 3, but we'll later see that that's usually not necessary to know. If we do a direct estimation of theta hat, which is the average of the x's, we get the value 0.57, and the standard deviation of this estimator is 0.25. This is just by summing the x's straight away. So now what we do is we do a control variate estimate, and we now, instead of just using x, we add c star times y minus the expectation of y to our estimator, and we have used the estimate of to get c star, the estimate of the covariance. The covariance was minus 0.14. And by doing this, our new estimator is 0.59, and the sample standard deviation is now 0.12. And clearly we can see that the standard deviation has been halved by this operation. So having the standard deviation means that we need 4 times fewer samples in the control variate technique. You can see here that the in this particular example, the covariance between x and y is positive, so x and y are positively correlated, which means that c star will be a negative number, so that we subtract the part of y that can be used to estimate x from the estimator. The third technique we're going to discuss is called conditioning. And again, we have a random variable z, which is a function of x. And we want to estimate the parameter, which is the expectation of z, which then is an expectation of phi of x. And now we assume that we have another observation such that the conditional average of z given w is known. Using that, we can show that if we just call this conditional expectation y, note that y is a random variable since w is a random variable. We can compute the expectation of y, and we can see that if we take the expectation, we simply get theta. So the expectation of y is the same as theta, so if we estimate y, we can also estimate theta. And more importantly is to show that the variance of y is actually less than the variance of zeta, that we can show. So what we can say is that y is a better estimator than z itself. And the idea is basically the practical implication is that we should not simulate what we're able to compute. The fact that we know the expectation of z given w we can represent in the following way, that our system actually has 2 components. One, we feed in x, and there's some random operation that we haven't control over. And the output of this operation is w, and then we feed w in the deterministic function that gives us z. One way we can do is we can generate x and observe z and make our estimates based on that. Or we can observe w and simply feed the w into the known function f, and we get a lower variance to our estimates. So here it's clear that we should simulate the first box, the first left-hand box, whereas the second right-hand box with the known deterministic function we should not simulate, we should simply compute. So this brings us to our first quiz. Again, 4 statements. We suggest that you pause the recording this time to figure out which of the statements are correct. And when you have the answers, you advance the video. And again, several answers may be correct. And here are the correct answers. Reducing the variance in our estimators can decrease the simulation time in our simulations. Conditioning is not based on the idea that you should have 2 simulations with negatively correlated input. That technique is called antithetic variates. C is also correct. Control variates method is based on removing those parts of the adaptation that are known by a linear regression. And D is also correct. The variance of the error of simulation decreases inversely proportional to n, the number of observed events, not necessarily the number of simulations that you perform. And if you have missed a question here, I think it's a good idea to review some of the previous parts of this lecture. The next technique has significant application to telecommunication applications, and this is called importance sampling. And it has to do with estimating parameters for corresponding to rare events that happen with very low probability, where our simulation otherwise will be very, very inefficient. The problem is that we have, as usual, x with the distribution f of x, and we want to estimate an expectation of phi of x, called theta here, where this function phi is such that it's dominated by a rare x. So the x's that where phi has a significant value, the probability of getting to those is very, very low. So this means that in order to get significant events that actually helps us to estimate theta, the number of simulation runs to get to those events is very, very large. So what is the trick that we apply here? Well, instead of generating x, we generate a different random variable, and we pick a different distribution function or density function called g of z, which is called the biasing distribution or the biasing density. And the idea is that z will happen much more often for those events where x is significant, or where phi of x takes significant values. And for this purpose we define the psi, which is this function phi times f divided by g. And we now have an estimator theta prime that is now the average of psi of z instead of phi of x. And we claim that this is now an unbiased estimator of theta, and this is proven in chapter 9 of Ross. We can also compute the variance of this estimator theta prime. So let's do a little bit more concrete example, which is very common in telecommunications. We have a rare event that we want to estimate the probability of. So we have this random variable x with this density function f of x, and we assume that the density is very thin for large x's, which means that the event x larger than t will have very low probability, and we want to estimate this very rare event. In classical simulation, we need to do very, very many runs. Let's say that the event only occurs in only 1/1000th of the cases, or the probability is 1/1000th. This means that we have to run 1,000 simulations to, on the average, get one of these events. And to get any type of performance in our estimators, we need too many events to occur. So classical simulation will be very inefficient for this type of events. So let's use importance sampling. First, we note that the probability can be written as an expectation of an indicator function, where the indicator function is 1 when the event occurs and 0 if the event doesn't occur. So we can write the probability in terms of an expectation as in the formula here. And then we apply the importance sampling technique. We, instead of generating x according to f of x, we generate x according to the biasing density g of x. So what we do here is to multiply and divide by g of x. And we can see we can interpret the integral as the expectation of the indicator function times this function w, which is the ratio of f and g, which we call the weighting function. And the simulation procedure now is straightforward. We generate x prime according to g of x instead. And of course we have picked g of x such that x prime will take values in the rare event situation much more often. And we get our estimator p hat. That is then the indicator functions times this weighting function w. Here are some common biasing densities. One is scaling, where we scale the x-axis with a factor a, or translation, where we basically shift the distribution of density with a factor a. So let's have a little quiz problem here to apply importance sampling. We take a particular example here. X is now an exponential distributed random variable with the density function as given in the slide. And we're interested in estimating a parameter of phi of x, and that function phi of x is only non-zero when x is larger than a, and we assume that a is much larger than 0. And the question here is, how can we use the translation biasing density to efficiently estimate theta, which is the expectation of phi of x. So I would like you to find the weighting function and the simulation procedure that should be used in this case. As usually, you pause the video at this stage and you solve the problem on a piece of paper, and then when you're ready, you continue the video to get the correct answer. So here's the solution. First we compute the biasing density, g of x, which is the translation of the exponential function, and we can get a graphical illustration on the right-hand side. So what we do is we take the exponential distribution of density and shift it to the right, to the point A. And the idea is, of course, that since we're interested in the events where x is larger than a, in this example here 15, there will be in the blue density very few of the outcomes of x will fall in this region. In this particular example it's a few percent, whereas the red distribution, biasing distribution g, will always generate x's in this region. So you can clearly see here from the areas that the number of simulation runs that we gain is in the order of 50. So we compute the weighting function, which is the ratio between f and g, and in this particular case, it turns out that the weighting function is not a function of x, it's actually a constant, e to the minus lambda a. And our simulation procedure is then simply to, instead of generating x according to f of x, we generate x according to g of x, and then we multiply our estimate with the weighting function, which in this case is the constant, so we simply multiply our estimate, our previous estimate, with e to the minus lambda a to get theta hat. The next technique we're going to discuss is called stratified sampling. And the trick here is basically to replace random experiment by studying outcomes systematically. And an example here is when the model contains a discrete random variable x, such that it has a probability distribution pi. And then we have observations z of x, and here it turns out that if we condition on x and make separate estimates theta prime I for each of the different xi's, we can get much lower variance than looking at z directly. So what we do is we do for every possible outcome of x, we do a separate simulation to get estimates theta I, and then we weight the different estimates with pi to get p prime as our final estimate. And this will give a lower variance than just studying z directly. So let's illustrate this in a simple example. This is the example 9Q of Ross' book. In this example, customers arrive to a store, and the store is assumed to have infinite amount of servers, and on good days they arrive with a rate of 12 customers per hour. On other days or bad days they arrive with a rate with 4 customers per hour. And bad and good days occur with probability 0.5 and the independent events to have a bad or good day. And the service time of each customer is an exponentially distributed variable with expectation 1 hour. And the store closes after exactly 10 hours each day, and the customers that haven't been completed their service, they will be lost. And the variable L here is the number of customers that are lost or cannot complete their service when the store closes. And we're interested in estimating the expectation of L. So in the straightforward solution, we simulate the system straight away. We look at the estimator theta hat, which is simply the arithmetic average of the observations Li. And in the book, we have computed the variance, and the variance in this case was 24 over n. In the other solution, we do 2 simulations. One is simulating a good day with a constant arrival rate of 12 customers, and in the other simulation we simulate other day or bad day. And so our estimator will be since these events occur with 0.5 probability each, our estimated theta prime will be 1/2 of the sum of the 2 estimators. And since now we want to compare it with the previous case, we must remember that in order to have the same number of simulations, we can spend only n½ simulations on the good day and n½ simulations on the other days in order to get the same number of simulations as the solution 1 to the left. And the variance here turns out to be, taking this into account, to be 4 over n½ which is the number of simulations for each case. And in total, the variance will be approximately 8 over n. And we can see by doing this, we can reduce the variance by a factor of 3. Finally, we're going to look at the technique which one can call experimental design or common random numbers. And this technique is particularly useful if you want to compare the performance of, let's say, 2 systems which are fed with the same type of input stimuli. Let's say that we have 2 random outputs from our system when fed with the random sequence X. One is the system that gives output z, which is a function phi of x. So we have the expectation z is the expectation of phi of x, and the other system where the output is the function psi of x. And we are interested in estimating the difference of these two expectations. So this is a parameter that is positive if the expectation of z is larger than the expectation of y, and vice versa. And the way to lower the variance, or one way to lower the variance, is to use not only the same input distribution x, but use identical realizations of x that usually yields better results. And the motivation for this is that if you look at the variance of the difference z minus y, we can see that there is a variance of z plus variance of y, and they have this negative covariance term. And if we plug in that z is phi of x, we get and y is psi of x, we get this relationship, and we can see that the covariance between phi x and psi of x. And if x is identically the same in both, we have a fair chance of getting a positive covariance, and that will decrease the variance in total. There's no guarantee that this will work for all systems, but it's usually a way to get a little bit of lower variance in these comparisons. So what you do here is obviously to use the same seed in our pseudo-random generator to guarantee that when we make the comparison between the two systems, that we use exactly the same input stimuli for both. And this technique you can try out and use. As I said, there's no guarantee that it works, but usually it gets slightly better results when it comes to performance, and it's virtually for free to use. And this completes the lecture 4 of the course.